You take a slow breath in. Smoke fills your lungs. For a moment, your mind softens. Your shoulders drop. Something in your brain quietly changes. This feeling is not new. It is not modern. It is not even close to modern. For most of human history, people have been lighting plants on fire and breathing in the result. Not for food, not for warmth, for the feeling. Today, more than 1 billion people smoke something. It's one of the most common human habits on Earth, and one of the most studied, most regulated, and most talked about substances in the world. But almost nobody asks the deeper question. Not, is smoking bad for you? Everyone knows the answer to that one. The real question is stranger. When did this actually start? Who was the first human to look at a plant, set it on fire, and breathe in the smoke on purpose? The answer takes you back much, much further than you'd expect. Further than farming, further than villages, further, in fact, than almost anything else we consider a defining feature of civilization. Let's go back, further than you think we need to. In 2015, a team of archaeologists was digging in the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah on land now used by the USAS Air Force. Today, this place is dry, cracked, and empty, one of the harshest environments in North America. But 12,000 years ago, it looked nothing like that. It was wetland, marsh. A braided river channel called the Old Riverbed cut through the landscape, and ducks filled the air by the thousands. Hunter-gatherers camped along its banks, drawn by the water, the birds, and the shelter. One of those campsites left behind a fire pit, just a shallow depression in the ground filled with ash and charcoal. Nothing remarkable to look at. But buried inside that ash were 4 small, charred seeds, barely large enough to see without a magnifying glass. Archaeologist Darron Duke of the Far Western Anthropological Research Group led the team that excavated the site. He and his colleagues carefully separated the ash using a technique called manual flotation, submerging the sediment in water so the lightweight organic material floats free from the heavier soil. That process is how the seeds were found in the first place. Tobacco seeds are tiny and rarely survive fire intact, which is exactly why this discovery was so unusual. It's worth pausing on just how easy this evidence was to miss entirely. Duke has pointed out that tobacco seeds almost never turn up at archaeological sites, even ones far more recent than Wishbone, simply because they're small, fragile, and not the kind of thing anyone was preserving on purpose. A single stray gust of wind at the wrong moment during excavation could have scattered those 4 seeds into the surrounding soil, erasing 9,000 years of history before anyone even knew it was there. The team also recovered seeds from other edible plants in the same ash layer, plants people are already known to have eaten, which suggests these campers weren't randomly gathering vegetation. They knew what they were collecting and why. The tobacco, sitting alongside genuine food plants, was there because someone chose to bring it there. To date the fire, Duke's team turned to the charred willow wood scattered through the same ash layer, the fuel that had built and fed the flames. Willow was likely the best burning wood available in that marshy environment, much as it still is in similar wetlands today. Radiocarbon dating on that wood gave a number that stunned the entire field of tobacco archaeology, roughly 12,300 years old. The seeds themselves belong to a plant called Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species that still grows across the American West today. And this detail matters. The seeds don't offer any nutritional value worth the effort of collecting them. They aren't attached to anything edible. As Duke pointed out afterward, the idea that a duck might have simply nibbled some tobacco and dropped a seed into a human campfire doesn't hold up. A duck would have to travel far outside its usual wetland habitat, climb into rocky foothills, and eat an uncommon plant it has no particular reason to eat. The far more likely explanation is the simple one. Someone brought the tobacco to the fire on purpose. This finding was published in the journal Nature Human Behavior in 2021, and it completely rewrote what scientists thought they knew. Before Duke's discovery, the oldest confirmed evidence of tobacco use in North America came from smoking pipes found in Alabama, containing nicotine residue that was chemically identified and dated in 2018 to roughly 3,300 years ago. For decades, that had been the accepted starting point for the entire history of tobacco. Then 4 burnt seeds, sitting quietly in a Utah hearth for 12 millennia, pushed that timeline back by another 9,000 years in a single publication. Sit with that gap for a second, because it's easy to read past a number like 9,000 years without letting it actually register. 9,000 years is longer than the entire span of written human history. It's longer than the Egyptian pyramids have existed, longer than the wheel, longer than agriculture in most parts of the world. If you tried to walk backward through time in 1,000-year steps from the Alabama pipes to the Utah hearth, You would pass through the invention of writing, the founding of the first cities, the domestication of wheat and rice, the retreat of the glaciers, and you would still have several thousand years left to walk. And through all of that unimaginable stretch of time, humans in North America were already doing something with tobacco that had nothing to do with survival in the strict sense. They weren't eating it. They were using it, deliberately, for an effect on the mind. Try to actually picture that campsite for a second. It's the very end of the Pleistocene epoch. Mammoths and other Ice Age giants are still alive somewhere on the continent, though not for much longer. A small band of hunter-gatherers has settled beside the marsh, close enough to hear the ducks at dawn. They've built their fire from willow wood, the best fuel this landscape has to offer. Someone hunts. Someone forages for edible roots and seeds. And somewhere in that daily rhythm, someone reaches for a wild tobacco plant growing nearby. Not to eat it, but to twist it, chew it, or burn it, purely for the feeling it produces. Archaeologists now call this location the Wishbone hearth. Alongside the tobacco seeds, they recovered more than 2,000 bone fragments from the site, most of them duck, along with stone spear points suited for hunting larger animals. This wasn't a single accidental fire. It was a working camp, a place this group returned to again and again. And tobacco appears to have been a normal part of life there, as ordinary as the fire itself or the birds overhead. From that point forward, tobacco use didn't stay confined to one small group in one desert marsh. It spread, adapted, and evolved across the Americas for thousands of years. Roughly 5,000 years ago, during what archaeologists call the Late Archaic period, people across the Midwest and Mid-South of what's now the United States began crafting the first known smoking pipes, simple conical stone or clay tubes. Over the following centuries, those basic tubes grew more elaborate. By the time of the Adena culture, roughly 800 BC to 100 CE, pipe making had become genuine artistry. In 1901, archaeologists excavating a burial mound near Chillicothe, Ohio, uncovered a nearly 8-inch stone pipe carved into the effigy of a standing man, wearing ear ornaments and a feathered bustle, with the tobacco bowl positioned between his carved feet and the mouthpiece running up through his head. That object, now known simply as the Adena pipe, is roughly 2,000 years old and is considered one of the finest pieces of art to survive from ancient Ohio. It was buried beside its owner, likely a person of high status, possibly a shaman, suggesting that by this point, smoking wasn't just a private habit. It carried spiritual and social weight. By around 3,300 years ago, that same nicotine residue evidence from Alabama shows indigenous communities in the southeastern woodlands were smoking through ceramic pipes as well. And the pipe tradition kept evolving long after the Adena people. A few centuries later, the Hopewell culture, centered in the same Ohio River Valley, took pipe carving even further. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of platform pipes from Hopewell ceremonial sites like Mound City and Tremper Mound, many of them carved into remarkably lifelike animal effigies: owls, toads, raccoons, hawks, beavers. These weren't casual decorations. The animal was typically carved facing the smoker, and many archaeologists believe these creatures represented spirit guides meant to assist a shaman in reaching a trance state during healing rituals. Smoking, by this point, had become a technology for reaching altered consciousness on demand, refined into genuine sculpture, buried with the people who used it as one of their most valued possessions. By the time Europeans finally crossed the Atlantic, tobacco use wasn't a fringe practice tucked away in one region. It was deeply woven into ceremony, medicine, treaty-making, and daily life across nearly the entire continent, from the Ohio Valley to the Caribbean coast. Entire diplomatic relationships between nations were sealed by sharing a single pipe, passed hand to hand, breath to breath, a ritual that later colonizers would come to know as the calumet, or peace pipe. Then, in 1492, ships reached the Caribbean, and everything changed. European sailors watched indigenous peoples roll dried leaves into bundles, light them, and inhale, and they had never encountered anything like it in their lives. Within a matter of decades, tobacco crossed the Atlantic in the opposite direction. A plant that had been quietly used, refined, and ritualized for roughly 12,000 years became a global commodity almost overnight, then a global industry, then eventually a global public health crisis. Today, the World Health Organization estimates that tobacco kills more than 8 million people every year. A habit that began as 4 scorched seeds in a hunter-gatherer's campfire now touches nearly every country on the planet. Here's where the story gets even stranger, because tobacco wasn't the only plant ancient people were setting on fire for its effects. And the second half of this story takes place on a completely different continent, among people who had no possible contact with anyone in the Americas. Halfway around the world, in the Pamir Mountains of far western China, 3,000 meters above sea level, sits a burial ground called Jerzonkel Cemetery, sometimes also referred to as Kuman Cemetery. Around 2,500 years ago, roughly 500 BCE, people here were performing elaborate funeral rituals at the edge of what would later become the Silk Road, a high-altitude crossroads where cultures and trade routes from across Asia converged. A joint team of archaeologists, led by Yang Yimin and Ren Meng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, working alongside researchers from the Max Planck Institute, examined 10 wooden bowls, called braziers, recovered from 8 separate tombs at the site. These weren't cooking vessels. They were built specifically to hold small stones that had clearly been exposed to intense heat. Using gas chromatography mass spectrometry, a technique that identifies the exact chemical fingerprint of organic residue, the team analyzed powdered samples scraped from the wood and stone. What they found, embedded in 9 of the 10 braziers, was cannabis. And this wasn't the low-potency wild cannabis that had been used in the region for centuries for fiber and grain. When the team compared their samples to cannabis remains from a different, older cemetery 1,000 miles east, they found something the older samples lacked entirely: chemical traces of tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, the compound responsible for cannabis's psychoactive effects, and at levels notably higher than typical wild plants of the era. The braziers themselves tell part of the story. They were built to hold hot stones, onto which mourners would place cannabis plant material. The resulting smoke would fill an enclosed space, likely a small tent or chamber, where multiple people gathered around the same source could breathe it in together. This wasn't a solitary habit. It was communal, and it was deliberate. This also wasn't recreational in the modern sense. It appears to have been ceremonial, tied directly to mortuary ritual, a way of altering the mind collectively during a funeral, perhaps to help mourners commune with the spirit world, or simply to share a collective, drifting state of grief and transcendence. Other objects recovered from the same tombs, including a stringed instrument resembling a harp and skeletal remains showing signs of trauma, hint at elaborate, layered funeral ceremonies that may have combined music, ritual, and altered consciousness into a single event. The location itself adds another layer to the story. Jerzonkel sits directly along ancient trade corridors that would later become part of the Silk Road. An isotopic analysis of skeletons buried there shows that nearly 1/3 of the people interred at the site were migrants, not locals. Alongside the braziers, archaeologists found glass beads, typical of Western Asia and silk that had traveled from far to the east, confirming that this remote, high-altitude cemetery sat at a genuine crossroads of cultures. The people buried there were likely connected to the Sogdians, and the cannabis itself may have arrived via the same trade networks that carried walnuts, apples, pistachios, and other goods across the mountains. This wasn't an isolated tribe stumbling onto a local plant by accident. It was a cosmopolitan community, sitting at the intersection of multiple cultures, and cannabis smoking appears to have been one of the things that traveled with them. And here's the detail that makes this discovery feel almost eerie, rather than simply old. About 2,000 years before any archaeologist ever laid hands on a brazier from Jerzonkel, a Greek historian had already described this exact scene in writing. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCA, described a nomadic people he called the Scythians, who lived across the broader region that includes the eastern Pamirs. He wrote that after a funeral, these people would climb into small tents, throw cannabis onto stones that had been heated red hot, and breathe in the thick smoke that filled the enclosed space around them, apparently reacting with visible pleasure. For centuries, historians treated this passage with polite skepticism, filing it away alongside Herodotus's other, more fantastical claims, like giant gold-digging ants and men with the heads of dogs. It read like a traveler's tall tale, dressed up for a Greek audience who had never been anywhere near Central Asia. He wasn't exaggerating. He was describing a real, specific, physical technology, and modern archaeology has now confirmed it in remarkable detail, right down to the wooden bowls and the deliberately heated stones. The people Herodotus was writing about were very likely connected to the Sogdians and Scythians, whose graves make up Jerzonkel Cemetery, a culture that followed early Zoroastrian religious traditions later associated with cannabis's mind-expanding properties in sacred texts. So by this point in the story, you have 2 completely separate ancient peoples on 2 separate continents, thousands of miles apart, with no contact between them whatsoever, independently arriving at the exact same basic idea. Take a plant, apply fire, breathe in the smoke, change your mind, which raises the obvious question. Why did this happen independently, in more than one place, so early in human history? Part of the answer sits inside your own skull, in a piece of biology that hasn't changed much since that fire in the Utah marsh. Nicotine and THC work through different pathways, but they both ultimately reach the same destination: the brain's reward circuitry, the same dopamine system that also responds to food, warmth, and social connection. Nicotine binds to receptors that were originally built to respond to a naturally occurring brain chemical, triggering a fast, short-lived surge of alertness and reward. THC works more slowly, latching onto a completely different receptor system, one that's involved in mood, memory, and pain, producing a longer, softer shift in perception. Neither of these systems evolved for smoking. They evolved for entirely different purposes, tied to survival and bonding. Smoking is, in a very real sense, a shortcut, a way of reaching directly into ancient neural machinery and pulling a lever that was never designed to be pulled quite that directly or quite that easily. Once early, humans discovered which plants could pull that lever, and that burning them made the effect faster and more shareable. The practice had every reason to spread and persist. Here's the counterintuitive part, the piece of this story that tends to surprise people the most. We tend to imagine early humans as purely, relentlessly practical, hunting for meat, foraging for calories, surviving one hard day at a time, with no spare time, energy, or interest left over for anything that didn't directly fill a stomach or keep a family alive. But that picture turns out to be incomplete, maybe even backwards. Long before humans in the Americas figured out how to reliably farm crops, long before people in Central Asia built permanent cities, they had already figured out how to intentionally alter their own consciousness, on purpose, as a shared social practice. The desire to feel different wasn't some luxury behavior that only showed up after survival was fully solved. It came first. It was already happening in the depths of the Ice Age, right alongside duck hunting and tool-making, at a campsite in the middle of a marsh that wouldn't be dry desert for thousands more years. That single fact reframes the entire idea of what an ancient human actually was. Not simply a hungry animal chasing its next meal across the landscape. A curious mind, already experimenting with its own brain chemistry, deliberately seeking altered states, tens of thousands of years before anyone anywhere had invented writing to record any of it. And once you notice that pattern, it becomes very hard to stop seeing it everywhere, because it doesn't just belong to the ancient world. You still do this. Every single day, in fact. That cup of coffee that sharpens your focus before a meeting. The glass of wine that softens the edges of a hard week. The reflexive scroll through your phone that quietly nudges your dopamine system over and over without you even noticing it happening. Different substances, different rituals, wrapped in completely different cultural packaging, but running on the exact same underlying instinct that was already fully alive in a Utah marshland 12,000 years ago and in a mountain funeral tent in Central Asia 2,500 years ago. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. Fire and hand-rolled leaves gave way to carved stone pipes, then to grinding, brewing, distilling, vaping, and swallowing. But the underlying impulse hasn't moved an inch. Humans have never simply accepted the mind they happen to be born with. We have always reached for something, anything, to adjust it, even just slightly, even just for a single evening. It's worth actually sitting with how long this has been going on, because the scale of it is hard to hold in your head all at once. 12,300 years separates you from that hearth in the Utah desert. In that span of time, entire empires rose from nothing and eventually crumbled back into the ground. Whole languages were born, spoken by millions, and then completely forgotten. The pyramids of Egypt were built, and then they simply sat there, becoming old monuments even by the standards of other ancient civilizations. And through nearly all of that time, in different corners of the world, completely unaware that the other existed, humans kept doing the same basic thing, taking a plant, applying fire, and breathing in whatever came next. 2 separate archaeological digs, thousands of miles and thousands of years apart. One ancient Greek writer who happened to get every physical detail exactly right, even though nobody believed him for 2,000 years. All of it points toward the same conclusion. This isn't a modern vice that somehow crept into an otherwise pure and simple ancient world. It's one of the oldest continuous behaviors on the human record. Older than farming in most parts of the world. Older than writing absolutely everywhere it's ever been found. So the next time you take a slow breath and feel something in you shift, even something as small as the smell of a fire or the first sip of coffee in the morning, remember what that moment actually is. Not a modern habit. Not something new, not something you invented, and not simply a bad decision or a good one either. Just one more entry in a very, very long human tradition, one that started around a fire in a desert marsh thousands of years before anyone thought to write any of it down.